Καλησπέρα και πάλι από την Αθήνα.
So, hello once again from Athens. We would like to welcome our friends who have just joined us for today's last session. It's a round table, and we all know from experience that round tables are among the most interesting highlights of a conference. During today's roundtable, we will listen to Professor Constantinos Cartalis. Our technical support staff has informed me that he has not yet joined us online. However, Professor Cartalis is a professor of environmental physics at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. We will also welcome Dr. Christos Giannakopoulos, a research director with the National Observatory of Athens, as well as the national focal point for the IPCC. Also with us, Professor Zervaki. Antonia Zervaki is an assistant professor of international relations with the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. And also with us, the Director of Modern Cultural Heritage within the Ministry of Culture and Sports, Ms. Stavroula Fotopoulou. She is actually my colleague. I believe that several interesting topics have been put to the table. In fact, I've listened some lovely suggestions being shared during the previous sessions. I would like to note the reflection of the current situation in terms of climate change, and also note the potential of cultural heritage in becoming a source of inspiration for the formulation of policies. Additionally, cultural heritage management may contribute to the mitigation of climate risks in the day-to-day life of communities. I think that one of the critical questions that result from what was shared today is the following. Where do all of these state policies meet? What is their point of convergence? It is understood that the climate change issue horizontally touches upon a variety of policies. But what is the common denominator thereof? I'm asking this question with particular reference to the safeguarding of cultural heritage. In my opinion, I don't know whether fellow panelists will agree on this, but in my opinion, it would be interesting to listen to their insight with respect to the role of local communities. Local communities are the main stakeholder. So, to what extent do local communities prioritize the climate change and its impact on cultural heritage? I think that this is also something that brings to mind a series of other questions with respect to the mobilization and engagement of communities, of ICH bearers, given that their knowledge, their skills, the concepts of the natural environment, the universe, the cosmos, matches what was previously described by speakers. But now I would like to ask Professor Zervaki to take the floor. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to share their views and insight. Then a discussion will follow among panelists along with a Q&A session. Feel free to ask questions using the chat function. So, Professor Zervaki, over to you.
Thank you very much. I should also like to thank you for this kind invitation and for the opportunity you gave me to attend these sessions, during which I learned a whole lot of things, and I believe that they are tied very well with my own research. I will talk about the UNESCO approach to climate change and the intangible cultural heritage. It is a complex issue that has not been dealt with systematically as of today, although the impacts are rather obvious, with the culmination being the organized transhumans, both in, well, primarily in the American continent. But the discussion about this issue, of this topic, nationally and internationally, is indeed a fragmented one still. And it is a front load bearing, or it has to do with the adaptation to the risks, and it has to do with the tangible heritage rather than intangible. So it's primarily a forward-looking thing. It has to do with the very substance and the very nature of heritage. It is difficult to delineate the sense of intangible heritage. We do have the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of UNESCO, but it is linked with the other dimensions and the meanings of that, with the protection of nature, with creative economy, but also with facets of human security, such as the safety and security of people within the community, the security of communities themselves, international peace and security, immigration issues, food safety and security, and so on and so forth. A second challenge is linked to methodology. Protection or the safeguarding of ICH as per the climate change phenomenon must be based on and combine various different knowledge systems, spanning from the indigenous and the local one to the scientific. And there is also a plethora of different ICH manifestations, which means that this beckons tailor-made, targeted solutions founded on different methodology, but based on common principles. Subsequently, we have the responses at the institutional and operational level on behalf of the UNESCO. As was mentioned during several presentations that preceded mine, intangible cultural heritage has to do with the actions, have to do with the prevention, and also actions that have to do with adapting to climate change. It is a fact, and this is something I should like to stress, that the international legal framework to deal with climate change and tackle it focuses primarily on the decarbonization of the cultures. It has nothing to do with cultural heritage, simple cultural heritage, or intangible cultural heritage. All it does is make provisions for the inclusion in the efforts for adaptation of traditional knowledge. There is reference to the rights of local populations on the side. Now, at the UNESCO level, the issue is dealt with on three levels. The first level has to do with the individual systems of different conventions. Here, in our case, we have primarily the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of the ICH. And also we should take into consideration that there are specific facets of the 1972 Convention on the Protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage, once again a UNESCO one, that have to do with intangible values of monuments of global importance. Here, an important role is played by the guidelines for the implementation of this convention. So these directives are non-legally binding texts that are a guide of sorts governing the implementation of the convention in the light of the new developments. So we have a constant interpretation of the convention. They refer to climate change, at least insofar as the 2003 convention implementation guidelines are concerned, and they have another dynamic because they may not be legally binding texts, but they do act as quasi-legally binding because any divergence from the implementation of the guidelines may deter the inscription of an element in the inventory, the UNESCO inventory, or it can lead to an inscription of an element that is already in the inventory to be inscribed in the ICH inventory or to jeopardize such an inscription. At the operational level, these guidelines introduce specific specifications and methodological models governing practical issues, such as the protection and promotion of the diversity, the inscription in the lists and catalogues, as well as the criteria that have to do with funding from the UNESCO's funds. Of course, we need to keep in the back of our hand that these operational guidelines have only to do with the elements that are inscribed or are eligible for inscription in the inventory. As I said before, the intangible aspect of culture also is included in other cultural heritage protection regimes, and there is a homogeneity in the way, or uniformity in the way, that these issues are dealt with by the various operational guidelines of the various conventions. So a first impression or a first conclusion we can draw is that there is no integrated, complete approach. There is a fragmented approach in the framework of the various protection frameworks. At a second level, the UNESCO in 2017 adopted the strategy for action on climate change that was implemented until 2021. The evaluation report was published recently, and again in this report, or rather in this strategy, we have a more general text. There is no specific reference regarding ICH, but here we have the general guidelines, the general directions that have to do with climate change and the strategy for action that can also be implemented in the case of ICH. Here we have the following three axes as of UNESCO. It is the need for a comprehensive approach, the drafting of a comprehensive strategy, the development of synergies with the other components of the UN system, and at the national level the support of the member states in adapting the social policies they have to do regarding education, the promotion of interdisciplinary knowledge, the utilization of cultural heritage and diversity to tackle climate change. And the positive thing in this strategy is that it is extrovert. It attempts to link the responsibilities of the organization with the goals of the Paris Agreement and those of sustainable development, and primarily the 13th goal that has to do with climate change per se. We need to take into advisement, though, that the strategy is implemented at a time when the United States left the organization. So this means that the funds available were greatly reduced. The funds to hold projects and pilot programs that would promote and highlight both the problems in the field as well as best practices. Finally, as regards the principles governing the climate change phenomenon at the level of the UNESCO, in 2017 we had the Declaration of Ethical Principles in relation to climate change passed and adopted. It is 6 special principles that are equally non-legally binding, but they can act as a roadmap for an integrated approach and management of the topic in relation to ICH. We have prevention of harm, even when we don't have scientific evidence regarding the danger for ICH. It is still on the top of the priority list. What is of interest, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on, is the principle that has to do with equity and justice. Here we have double facets in both notions. We have inter- and intergenerational equity, and it has to do with the enjoyment and the respect of cultural rights from current generations, but also to its being intergenerational equity. It is already known from the protection of the environment sector that links the intangible cultural heritage with humanity's rights as a whole. As was mentioned by Dr. Schreiber in her presentation, this was the case. Now, regarding justice, we need to make a distinction between distributive justice, which is the protection of the interests of the groups, communities, peoples who are not responsible for the climate change phenomenon, but are equally at risk of losing their ICH as a result thereof. And on the other hand, we have the notion of procedural justice. That has to do with participatory governance models, public participation in drafting, implementation, and evaluation procedure of public policies that have to do with the management of ICH. Of course, we have the link to sustainable development in all three aspects thereof: environmental, social and financial. We have solidarity. It's something that Mrs. Schreiber said that was very correct in her presentation today, that in ICH we want local solutions. Be that as it may, they will need to be introduced and included in a global framework and structure of such policies that need to be inspired by solidarity. They need to be permeated by solidarity as financial support of the vulnerable groups of ICH that are in situ danger, or as initiatives at the local, regional and international level to manage and handle specific challenges, like for instance transhumance, the movement of populations, or climate immigrants due to the climate change. Finally, we have scientific knowledge that will ensure, safeguard integrity in decision-making. In conclusion, there will have to be a more systematic collaboration among the committees of the various UNESCO conventions so as to have a cohesive policy framework for the ensemble of cultural expressions and achieve the necessary synergies. As regards funding, we still remain at the international level. We will need to have a cooperation of sorts among the various sources of funding for scientific research and for the implementation of projects, apart from the UNESCO funds that do not have sufficient resources to support large-scale projects. What also exists is other financial organizations or funds like the World Bank, for instance, or the Green Climate Fund, or European Union funding mechanisms and tools, or the Nordic Development Fund that can, in fact, finance or co-finance such projects. At the national level, it would be prudent to incorporate in the national action plans to handle and tackle climate change of the dimension of ICH, either in terms of protection and prevention or adaptation to climate change, and of course to take measures as far as education is concerned. Now, herein lies perhaps the most important part. Education is approached primarily by UNESCO as a means of sensitizing and raising awareness, public awareness, and primarily the young, as regards the issue of climate change and the need to take action. It is my belief that the role of education at this stage needs to be enlarged, expanded. There needs to be a new philosophy in the interdisciplinary curricula. The Eric Nordstrom approach was a very interesting one. We heard about that in the morning session. So what needs to be safeguarded is the interdisciplinary approach of climate change as a phenomenon, taking into consideration the local features, characteristics and needs that need to be met. Curricula need to be specialized and to utilize traditional knowledge on natural resource management. This will allow the combination of scientific and traditional knowledge and the feedback between the two at the level of research. Furthermore, education, and this has to do with political culture that needs to change, needs to shape those skills and those dexterities that will allow for a participatory culture in the management of ICH and climate change as a phenomenon. A culture that will allow for the transition from teams, groups or communities as bearers of ICH in the sense of cultural ownership to their perception in a sense of agency. And the work of Elinor Nordstrom and what we heard about the sacred forest is moving in that direction. So a necessary requirement for all this is to have sufficient protection and respect of human rights. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Zervaki. I believe that your remarks were very interesting and very important, and they will be very useful in our discussion. I should now like to give the floor to Mr. Constantinos Cartalis. I hope we have restored his connection with us. So, Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I found it difficult to connect with you online. So, I would like to add to what has already been said, picking up on human rights. Any climate change issue is related to human rights issues. The climate change impacts on a variety of human rights. But we tend to consider climate crisis in technical terms, overlooking the fact that it affects the life of communities. Thus, it creates new balances. For example, we often witness the impact of climate changes in areas other than temperature or humidity or whatever, but in the fact that some skills are becoming obsolete. There are some professions that are no longer sought. Therefore, the community needs to find ways to make use of its human resources. It is estimated that approximately 400,000 people will be left unemployed, particularly because they will be forced to change their career path in the wake of the climate crisis. For example, we will gradually abandon the use of fossil fuel. And the ICH is a topic of interest in the climate change issue. For example, let's talk about a city. Let's talk about a city such as Sevilla. Sevilla has an arabesque background, therefore it is able to make use of water resources at night. This used to be a daily practice in the past, but it has long been forgotten. It is currently in the process of being revived in the light of climate change adaptation. So this requires technical plans and designs. There needs to be an identification of areas where windscreens will be installed and so on. But we need to take note of the tradition of local communities as appropriate so as to make use of them as our guide. And I think that this discovery was a mere accident. In fact, this discovery of this long-forgotten practice created a momentum that was later built upon. There are several similar practices. Some of them are actually encountered in Greece, and we can make use of them. And this brings me to my next point. There is this trend dictating that one size fits all. That cannot be further from the truth. No single plan can be adapted at all locations without previous tailoring. Therefore, we cannot have a single blueprint to be reproduced in all cases. Also, we need to take into account the mindset, the background of each community and society so as to make sure that they will be able to effectively respond to crisis. And this opens up a new series of parameters and variables. We are faced with a deficit in terms of integrating ICH in our climate crisis plans. The data we gathered allowed us to identify that there is a multifaceted approach to this issue. It might involve the Ministry of the Environment or the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of Climate Crisis and so on. But when we come to the point where we talk about cultural heritage, particularly tangible cultural heritage, then most countries do not have such a capital. Our country does have such a capital, however, it has failed to take a deep dive therein. And I think that we need to take a deeper dive into what is required. And also, there is a key stakeholder that is absent. Whenever we talk about tangible cultural heritage, we can realize that it is very easy to quantify parameters. For example, we can see what happens after a wildfire. We've seen that in the past. But let's talk about the national level. At national level, we need to draw on our cultural capital following two different paths. The one path is the climate change impact, and the other path is the tailoring of the adaptation plan. And this is the most interesting route because it highlights rights, it highlights the right to continuity, the right to non-relocation, non-displacement, thus safeguarding the local traditions and practices, as well as the interests of local residents and populations. And also it preserves the national brand. Clearly this happens because it is a token of the country's effort to preserve its nature and heritage. During the Glasgow conference, there was a huge effort made by different countries so as to address the climate change impact on cultural heritage. This was not an easy task. Our country participated in these efforts. However, we are still lacking an understanding of the value of cultural heritage within the context of climate crisis. Therefore, at global level, it is up to UNESCO to take the initiative and take the lead. And this duality I mentioned earlier, meaning addressing climate crisis while also tailoring adaptation plans, should be further prioritized. I believe that would be worthwhile. In conclusion, I could not agree more with what Professor Zervaki said about education. Education is the core of our efforts, allowing ICH to find its place in our efforts. It is only through education that we can generate a momentum. Without such momentum, and I'm a pessimist, I must admit, without this momentum, no matter how many technical interventions are pursued, they will be doomed to fail, because local societies will treat them as something foreign, as something they cannot own up to. And this is why I think that today's forum has showed us different ways to reach out to the community within the country, within our region, and at global level. Thank you very much, Professor. I think that what you just shared was very interesting. Personally, I think that it is very significant to note what you said about the difficulties in quantification of ICH. Although the loss of jobs is an indicator, and if I may add, the statistics relating to the impact of ICH on the economy at local and national levels are useful, and in fact, this is something that is not only applicable to Greece, but to all countries. But now I would like to welcome Dr. Christos Giannakopoulos. Over to you. So, hello. I would like to say a few things about IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC is mostly responsible for new reports on climate change, compiling recent data. Such reports are periodical. The last one was published in 2021. Its report consists of 3 books. Book number 1 is the purely scientific component, including simulations and climate models. Book 2 mostly focuses on the climate change impact and adaptation strategies, and Book 3 focuses on measures to address climate change through decarbonization, through reduced CO2 emissions, and so on. So there is a clear distinction between our potential for adaptation and our potential to address the climate change. And adaptation measures mostly involve countries local authorities and local societies. Whenever we talk about ICH, we mostly talk about adaptation measures and climate change containment measures. It seems that the Mediterranean is in fact a climate change hotspot, given that its temperature rises at a faster pace compared to the rest of the planet. This is particularly manifest in summertime. Also, there are more frequent extreme weather conditions. For example, there are heavier and more frequent rainfalls compared to what is the case globally. And we all know that the Mediterranean is also a site of many cultural monuments. Therefore, I want us to insist on the specificities of the Mediterranean region. This is the place where good farming and livestock farming practices are encountered. In the past, people had to deal with the forces of nature. Therefore, they adapted their strategies, their survival practices. They could not know what the future reserves for agriculture, so they needed to effectively prepare themselves. And like Mr. Cartalis said, when we talk about strategies and methods that can now be applied, but which used to be applied in Arab countries, well, in the energy sector, among other sectors, we will have the opportunity to see such practices pursued in Mediterranean countries as well. In the past, these practices were only followed in Arab countries or perhaps Northern African countries. So we will be reproducing useful models. Yet another important aspect of ICH is the impact on the health of the local population. This may include not only the permanent residents, but also visitors, tourists, and this is where the tourism industry comes into play. And we cannot separate tangible and intangible cultural heritage. There is an inextricable link between the two. You all know that monuments attract people, but if the surrounding natural environment is ruined, then the monument will not be as attractive as it used to be. So, that said, ICH is also linked to customs and practices that may be revived for the sake of tourism. So, if the visitability of an area is affected, then some of these practices and customs may be forever lost in time. So we need to insist both on tangible and intangible cultural heritage, considering climate data from the past, along with simulations and forecasts for the future, while considering changes to customs and practices in the course of time. And above all, we need to combine climate databases with current experience and observations so as to produce appropriate policies. Thank you. Thank you. I think that your last comment on policies and holistic approaches actually was very insightful, I would say. But now let's ask Ms. Fotopoulou to take the floor.
Hello again. I believe we had a very productive, beautiful day. And what was most impressive for me was how many of the things we heard had a cohesion around. I don't think you can hear you very well, says Mr. Cartalis. Okay, now that's better, it's louder. I was saying that from all the presentations we had the opportunity to follow today, what struck me as most interesting was that two points that were common in all of them. The first is the need to have very good local knowledge of what happens locally, because whatever we have to do in regards with adapting to climate change is a plan that needs to be precise and concise and tailor-made for each case. And the second thing is that it was made perfectly clear that intangible cultural heritage is not outside people, it's not external to them, as monuments may be. Monuments are an external reference of a community. It may be inextricably linked to its identity or its existence, but it's outside of it. Intangible is the people themselves, and the people who suffer these adverse impacts of climate change are the same people, well, not the same identified as persons, but it is us as an ensemble of the humanity who have caused this adverse change in the climate. We are the ones who became in a climate circle, vicious circle, and we have deteriorated some of its elements, and we are now talking about how we can better deal with it and adapt to it. The solution is again on us, the communities. And the other, it's the big guns, the great weapons that we have. And the first of all is that it creates communities, it creates cohesion. What we need to tackle climate change crisis and all the other crises that we see unfold, the health crisis, for instance, or be that, it's resilience in people's communities. And this is something ICH offers us. Making elements of ICH happen help the enhancement of community cohesion. It's not just wishful thinking, okay, it's not just a good idea that could be implemented. It's something that can actually practically happen. How, you may ask? Well, first of all, we need to ascertain the need to, how shall I put it, to talk about climate change to population groups that will suffer its consequences and may question that it actually exists or are poorly informed. ICH is a very good way to achieve this level of information. How? Well, by promoting and showcasing rituals and customs of people and saying that what you do today is the answers given to your predecessors to questions and problems they had to deal with in their time. And they were successful answers because they still exist today. Those who were unsuccessful no longer exist. So if there is something we stand to gain from the way we celebrate various things, from festivals or whatever, if we can stand to win from something, from the way of communities are created around the music we celebrate, if there is something we stand to win from the know-hows that have high cultural value, it is one thing. So by presenting them, by creating those conditions that will allow them to be perceived as successful responses of previous societies to questions and problems they had. In this way, we can add to the self-confidence of the people by saying that the problems always existed, people always found solutions to them in a collective way. Now, the answers we need to come up today for climate change need to be reached collectively as well. So it is an exceptional tool for education, for the increase of conscience and consciousness regarding issues that have to do with intangible intangible cultural heritage and climate change. The second thing is that we can utilize people's potential through systems that are called citizen science platforms, CSPs, which is fora of people who are encouraged to participate in research and monitoring several natural phenomena. So people who are not specialist scientists may note their observations or say about things that they see change in their environment. They were created in England, they're very interesting, and we can use them. We can create such spaces on the internet. Primarily, this is how it happens. Maybe we can have some physical spaces or sites created through which we get the feedback from the people regarding things that are small and simple, from the change of the course of a small river during wintertime. And this has to do with people who cultivate their land way further down the road, or from the road changing its course. And this is something we've seen time and again, a road changing because the river changed its course. So it's systems that can obtain the dynamic of the remarks and observations each and every one of us who make about a location, and it's one again, the location, the locality that is necessary, that they use it, they see it change. When they can give them the space to express it in a way that someone else can gather the ensemble of that information and give them the bigger picture of why it happens, it's a very good tool for the people to become more aware, to become sensitized, and to make it clear to them as to what happens from climate change. But in this system, it's not just them being passive informants. They are involved, they are engaged, they have an interest in what happens, as to what their remarks will do and how they will be utilized to change things. And I don't know, many things can change on the basis of these remarks. And the last thing is to be able to encourage people to make creative use of those past solutions that exist within the ICH and were the right answers to questions of the past. So we do not look at ICH in a nostalgic way and say how nice it was to have this song or this frock or this art. This can still have notion, and it still exists today. And if you can use this tradition creatively, there's a lot to gain, there's a lot we stand to gain. Small answers, local solutions can be found, can be discovered by people and communities who are impacted by climate change this way, through the creative revisiting, re-evaluation of traditions that exist in their new version and in their new use. Summing up, I should like to say that we're faced with a crisis that resulted primarily from our own actions, and that human actions can in turn help for this crisis to be averted, to be dealt with the least possible loss. Thank you. Right, well, I believe that we have a great number of issues raised by all four panelists. I would like to share a bit of thought that I had born inside my head after listening to all four panelists who had the floor. First of all, I don't think we should believe that local communities or local bearers of ICH have full knowledge of the practices that were dealt with in the terms of ICH 2 or 3 generations ago. I mean, many a time we have lost this cultural memory, and I believe that public policies, as far as ICH is concerned and CH, need to be conducive to the reconnection or the the connection of the communities of ICH, the local communities, with the cultural heritage per se. The other issue that I would like to raise with the discussants is that stemming from the obligation of the country to file the 10-year report for the implementation of the Convention for the Safeguarding of the ICH, we discovered, well, it's not something we didn't know, but we discovered it in a very, well, tangible way, that there is a full, total absence of ICH from curricula, primarily in technical schools, in polytechnic schools, in university departments dealing in the practical sciences, the polytechnics, the civil engineers. But I don't know whether our colleagues remember that we discovered that there is almost no subject at all promoting and highlighting the importance of wood shipmaking in any polytechnic school in the country and the former technical educational institutes. So, if there is no training of technical scientists in the facets of ICH that have to do not only with that part of ICH, it is very difficult to have interdisciplinary scientific groups or teams such as the ones described by Mr. Giannakopoulos earlier, that can have a holistic approach of sorts of this whole issue of dealing with climate change. Now, I don't know whether we still have Mrs. Andromachi Konomou as an attendee or our colleagues from the Agricultural University of Athens. I think they have some best practices of such interdisciplinary approaches to share in terms of agri-food traditions that might be useful for us to hear. I don't know which of the four interlocutors wants the floor, and I don't know what questions we may have from our audience, remarks and whatnot. Is Mrs. Konomou with us still? You may take the floor if you'd like and raise some issues, make some remarks that I'm sure you have to share with us. If not, Mrs. Bignari? Yes, I'm here. What would you like me to do? What practices we do? What training we do? Well, for instance, I don't know whether you have developed a field of collaborations in vines and local viticulture. Greece is one of the countries that has a very rich heritage in terms of viniculture and wine, and traditions that are linked with the vine and wine identity of the country. I don't know whether you have a network of collaborations, because I would like to share my experience, and I believe that our science here, geography, anthropology, has a lot to say for traditional vine cultivations and for other things. I don't know whether you have utilized in an interdisciplinary sense or spirit the possibility or the capabilities, the capacity of other colleagues from other fields of science to be conducive to add to viniculture.
Well, yes, we have set up several partnerships. Like I said, our laboratory dates back to the 1920s. It coincides with the establishment of our university. We've been accredited and we have visited numerous islands. There is great local wealth to be built upon. And we need to trust people and allow them to pursue their cultivating practices. And I will insist on vine growers. It is very difficult for them to keep on pursuing traditional methods. They are all eager to adopt state-of-the-art methods. I totally disagree with this. I insist on them following traditional vine growing practices. For example, in Santorini, the kouloura is a traditional viticulture method that needs to be safeguarded. It cannot be abandoned. We cannot do what the rest of the world does. It seems that there is a trend involving the use of machinery. I understand this trend, but I try to discourage them from embracing these methods. So, within our laboratory, we have visited several islands, we inspect the vineyards, we assess the potential of each vineyard and try to help people, the vine growers, identify the methods that are most appropriate to them. And now, in the wake of the climate change, we actually see that the knowledge of previous generations actually serves the end product, and it adds value to it. Okay, good. I don't have access to the chat function, so are there any questions from our audience? Perhaps one of you would like to take the floor. It would be interesting to... Oh, it seems that Mr. Kostas Markakis would like to intervene. Mr. Markakis, please, the floor is yours.
Μας ακούει ο κύριος Μαρκάκης? Μέχρι τότε, ναι.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, we can. Good, good. Okay, I thought that I would not be able to intervene. So good. I have two generic comments to make. Based on studies conducted by myself in recent years, out of journalistic interest. In my opinion, I think that we have greatly underestimated the climate crisis as well as its inherent risks. I think that all speakers failed to properly assess these risks. So, firstly, new technologies that are considered green technologies, for example, electric vehicles, wind panels, solar panels, and so on, come hand in hand with a dark side, and this is rarely mentioned. For them to be marketed, mining is required. In fact, scarce resources, rare resources, need to be mined. This implies great use of carbon and natural gas. Therefore, the impact on local communities and the environment is dramatic to such an extent that, in line with studies conducted in France and elsewhere, the environmental footprint of the so-called green technologies is far worse from the footprint related to the rational use of available technologies. And this is what we should be doing, at least up until the time where truly environmentally friendly technologies become available. That's issue number one. And I can provide you with evidence if necessary. Secondly, all large countries engaged in natural gas and oil drilling, including shale gas, among others, invest trillions of dollars in these technologies, aiming to exceed 600 megatons, and this implies the risk of a further increase in temperature by 2.7 degrees Celsius. I'm talking about carbon bombs. A carbon bomb is an investment plan that throughout its lifetime may produce more than 1 million tons of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. The latest study comes from Scotland. These investment plans and schemes originate from the US and Canada. There was this other research conducted by The Guardian. So there are different teams of journalists, for example, the German network Arte, that have studied this issue and reached the same conclusions or similar conclusions. And we are not in the stage of climate crisis. We're in the stage of planet destruction. Thank you. Thank you very much. However, I should remind you of the fact that today's event was not about the climate crisis in general. There are many different facets thereof. Some of them you touched upon yourselves. But today's forum had to do with the climate change impact on cultural heritage. And also, today's forum highlighted the potential of cultural heritage in mitigating the impact of the climate crisis. These were the topics of today's forum. However, personally, I find what you just shared very interesting. Okay, on last note, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me. I am very well aware of today's topic. However, I think that if we want to be pragmatic, all of these discussions should be built around the truth, not around a misrepresentation of the truth, as lovely as that may sound. Thank you. I don't think that we've been talking all day using a lovely representation of the reality. Anyhow, perhaps Ms. Petanidou would like to say something at this point. Yes, she is with us. Good. Okay. It would be interesting, Ms. Petanidou, to tell us, does the dry stone walling have the potential for integration with contemporary architectural designs produced by either the public sector or the private sector? For example, there's this national highway that is currently being built. Can this traditional technique be integrated therewith? Okay, my opinion is that this is what should be done, because this will create new jobs, it will make use of stones, and we have many stones, particularly around the Aegean, and also this will allow a greater diversity in terms of habitats, in terms of biotopes and microsites that will serve as hubs for both flora and fauna. So I think that this is what should be done. Truth be told, it has not been done so far. Mr. Markakis is experienced in this issue because he has cooperated with the Taigetos project and the mountainous paths they are on. To the best of my knowledge, there's this group that was established a few months ago. They are interested in the dry stone walling landscape across Greece. They're just taking the baby steps. They've had their first meeting in December, 6 months ago. So dry stone walling should somehow be integrated with the practices required under Greek law. Some technical projects of national interest funded by public money should make use of this traditional method. And I think that this group that was formed recently will play a major role in this direction, and clearly the civil society, NGOs and all dry stone walling funds will contribute. I think that this technique will address a number of problems and give way to new potential. And above all, it will be an antidote to this increasingly dehumanized landscape. You know, when I first started studying the dry stone walls, the municipality suggested we pave a traditional path with dry stone walls. This was a path that was made of concrete, so our intervention would actually show pupils and any interested parties another way forward. Clearly, we did not agree to this. We thought that we're not supposed to camouflage concrete, we're supposed to build dry stone walls from scratch. Yes, what you say is very, very interesting. This is a concept that you criticize. Dry stone walls are not only for appearances. No. This is ancient knowledge that was passed to us, and it's a timeless survival method. But it can be used as a pretext, as an ornament. Yes, and we need to ostracize this from our practice. And if I may, please, go ahead. The Terrascape project was very successful. Therefore, we can build on its legacy. We feel that the Aegean University in the coming 5 years will do its best, will make maximum efforts to convey this knowledge to schools, pupils. We will allow the local population to learn and also take pride in what they used to be and what they can become once again. Thank you.
We should like to thank you very much for your intervention. I would like to let everyone know that we have 5 minutes before the link is complete, so I can see that from those who are with us, None of them have raised a question. I can see a raised hand. It's Mr. Markakis, is it? Yes, Mr. Drinis. I believe that Mrs. Petanidou allowed me the opportunity to take the floor again. I will be very brief. Yes, says Mr. Drinis, yes, please be. Mr. Markakis says there is a huge issue that has to do with cultural heritage, the tangible cultural heritage and the intangible one as a consequence. All the thousands of kilometers of calderims that are the result of dry stone structures and are not legally, the pathways and the paths have no legal protection. So there is no possibility to protect them by law as not to be described, because there is an urban planning problem as per our legislation. So when a road is recognized as of common or public use, as we're asking for the calderims to be, this gives a possibility for the real estate plots that are around the roads to build. So without this administrative act, they cannot be entered into the national register. The cobblestone paths these calderimia are at risk of being destroyed. So we asked the Ministry of the Environment to intervene. We had a first ministerial decision a few days ago. I will give you the date. The technical specifications, criteria and the requirements to record and register the current road network, where we have incorporation, as we ask them, the calderims and the small paths and pathways called old non-carriageways, as were in the past, but it requires a huge amount of technical specifications and issues. So we wanted to see what happens in what happens back in 1965 and the rural planning plans and designs and surveys should be entered there. So we're the local associations trying to save them. Right, thank you very much. I don't know whether one of the discussants would like to say a few words as an epilogue of sorts. Mr. Cartalis, do you want to say a few words? Well, I believe that many interesting points were raised by all speakers. Resilience must be looked at in a different way. Vulnerability needs to have a different composition in terms of parameters. Well, in science, when we're talking about the present, we're certain. When we're talking about the future, we're cautious, which is why we have various scenarios. We have a moderate, a pessimistic, an optimistic scenario. A good thing is to present all of them and allow the citizens to understand the complexity of the issue, and also to understand that in science one needs margins when talking about 30 years from today. And personally, I would prefer any future mining for one, mining to build wind turbines rather than investments to have lignite, natural gas or oil. And I believe that these should be my final words. Let's give the floor to Mrs. Fotopoulou or anyone else from the other discussants who wishes to take the floor. Mrs. Zervaki. Right, yes, thank you. What I take as a take-home message from today's meeting is the dynamic of ICH that remains not only in Greece but also in other countries. It remains untapped. It is the need for interdisciplinary collaboration and dialogue on these issues. We need to learn to speak the same language. It's different when we're talking about different sciences, but I believe that it's worth a try. It's worth the effort. Indeed, Mr. Giannakopoulos? Well, just a brief intervention from me as well to follow suit. I should like to focus on cultural heritage between areas and between countries. Knowledge and how we can use scientific knowledge. We could find climate analogues in the future, like Mr. Cartalis said we have in security. And we can have simulations where we can have climate analogues. The climate future of Crete may possibly resemble the climate present of Cyprus. So the future of Crete, climate-wise, may be the present of Cyprus. So we can find practices in intangible cultural heritage that were used or are still used in Cyprus in the past, in this climate analog, and we can have some similar adaptation measures to be implemented in the climate future of Crete that is today. So this is interdisciplinarity and the use of scientific knowledge in various local and regional levels. Thank you. Thank you very much. Billy, you have the floor. I should like to thank everyone for their patience in this discussion and for your participation. I'm talking about the speakers now. I believe it was a very productive day. We should like to keep many of the things that were heard. The last example about the dry stone walls and dry stone terraces is very important for several things. The intersectorality about what we're talking about in intangible cultural heritage. The issue of dry wall terraces, it's something that touches on various areas of public administration in terms of regulations. We're talking about the Ministry of the Environment, and I don't know who does the maps anymore. We're talking about the competent ministry as to how they characterize calderiums, roads, paths, and everything. There is a regulatory competence issue that needs to be resolved, but there are other issues that have to do with education, training, insurance, security, the taxation of craftsmen. If a dry wall stone craftsman is insured or they have what they need, and these are issues that we can resolve not by waving a magic wand, but we need to promote and showcase dry stone walls and the craftsmen who actually build them. And this is a paramount thing. It's a profession, the characteristics, the taxation and insurance regime and status, and what we need to do. We saw that there are many other issues revolving around that need regulation, and of course all this can only happen in two ways. First of all, with the initiatives of citizens who are interested in it, but also with the work that happens locally. And we can see how important it is to use the dry stone way of building in various areas. There are such initiatives we've seen in Epirus, we see that in Santorini. It is the work that is being completed. It's a terrascape in Andros. All this creates a database that will be of great use. Knowing that we still have a long way to go, but also knowing that what we're talking about is very important and very beautiful at the same time, I believe that we will meet again and we'll find ourselves again in front of such issues. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much for the participation. Thank you very much for the organization. Thank you for the invitation. Be well, stay safe. Enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy your summer.